Before the conference, we asked speakers to submit a policy recommendation or two related to their session. And some speakers submitted, some didn't. And what I've tried to do is just kind of summarize what I heard today, calibrate that with the suggestions that were given, and come up with themes that seem to be supported across the sessions. And there's a few points of tension which are interesting as well. But the 7 themes that I recorded are: 1, transparency in policy; 2, being upfront about trade-offs; 3 is local control, although there's a little tension there that I'll describe in a moment; 4 is flexibility and approaches, so not prescriptive, but there's a little bit of tension with that one as well. 5 is don't distort price signals, or at least try to find ways for price signals to be meaningful. 6 is allow greater participation in markets. And 7 is the one I'm least uncomfortable with, and that's maybe allow a little industrial policy. So let me just say a few words about these, and then if I miss something.
No, you're off the stage on the last one. I'm sorry, I get the hook.
So the first one on transparency and policy is with regulations and subsidies. Be upfront about what the costs and benefits might be. Put the chips on the table so that people can evaluate, especially the costs. Gary Leibkap brought this up in the first session. Who bears those costs? Should be upfront in kind of understanding what the distribution is. Benefits can be more difficult to estimate. That came up in the session on environmental markets, but there should be some attempt to estimate those and be transparent. In the area of energy and energy transitions, there's three issues that came up: reliability, risk, and kind of reality. And so transparency involves being upfront about those, involving experts, scientists, economists, engineers, to give information as they understand it so it's out there. And then for public lands, the transparency is something like a balance sheet, so people can see what are the management costs, and you don't have to dig in with a specialized research assistant to understand those. Related to that is being upfront about trade-offs, so that's number 2. Trade-offs in the energy transition were about reliability, affordability, and clean energy. So and there's trade-offs typically in terms of those. Being upfront about those is a policy recommendation. Related to that is the session about Andrew Waxman talking about carbon capture. There can be trade-offs between what is locally clean, globally dirty, and vice versa. So carbon capture processes can affect local air pollution, sometimes in negative ways. So those are trade-offs that need to be put out there. It's a policy recommendation.
If I can, out of that session, the one thing I just popped into the discussion and maybe got short shrift was optionality. I thought that was a really useful addition to what we need to think about in the energy transition context. The more optionality we have, the better, not less. So if we all have to drive cars of this sort, or we have to have light bulbs of that sort, it seems to me optionality is important.
Absolutely, that's a recommendation that came through in the sessions to specify goals through policy, but not necessarily pathways. So that's important with energy transition. It's important, say, in the offset markets that Will Raffe talked about. There's a goal to reduce the loss of, or slow the loss of wetlands, but not necessarily a prescription for how to do that. And this is different than command and control, which is, the essence of the mandate here. There was a little bit of tension here because there was some recommendations for adaptive management, to learn while doing, to update regulations in response to new information, which is flexibility. But there's also a concern that too much updating too quickly can reduce regulatory certainty. And for any kind of market, including environmental markets, regulatory certainty is an important thing. So a little bit of tension between too much change, too much flexibility, and the certainty that markets and market investors need to rely upon. The local control also had a little bit of tension. So most benefits and costs of environmental policies are borne locally. Gary made that point. It came out in the public land session. And it's certainly true about energy decisions affecting tribal nations. Those are really local effects. Came out in that session. Came out in the discussion about energy poverty, and it came in the discussion of public land management, that local people can be affected by forest fire risk, and state land managers might account for more things on the balance sheet than federal land managers. The tension with local control that came up during the James Coleman's comments is with big infrastructure investments that span lots of space. States in particular, he mentioned, could hold up an infrastructure project like a oil and gas pipeline, like a transmission line for the transmission of renewable energy. And so there is some tension that came up. There's also, fire from forests can pass state boundaries, and so regional areas can be affected by decisions. So, a majority of the conversation was in favor of local control, but some tension there. In terms of price signals, the message from the session on climate adaptation, on natural disasters, was loud and clear that you shouldn't have price signals that subsidize risk, either implicitly or directly. Insurance pricing should reflect real risks, and so if there's government intervention that distorts that, that's going to distort behavior, and you read about the consequences in the news. There was also a little discussion about price signals and carbon credits, namely that if carbon credits aren't additional, then the price should be zero. And in fact, they're not always priced accordingly given their contribution to carbon sequestration. I had two more that were on this list.
Just remember, I'm not the one that's keeping you from going out there.
Another one that came up a bit by me and maybe a few others is allowing greater participation in markets, so markets can better reflect and better kind of provide information about what the level of environmental quality is that people want when they have to, when it can't be cheap talk and we put our money where our mouths are. So potentially use market processes, not just to trade in a cap and trade system, but to learn what the cap should be. And Gary's discussion of the Clean Air Act got at this a little bit. Are we way past the point where the marginal benefit in another unit of clean air is much lower than the cost? Well, allowing kind of market bidding on that cap could provide information. It could as well in public land use decisions. If you allowed greater participation in bidding for public land use, you might allow markets, not politicians and bureaucrats, to tell you kind of what, how people value different uses of the public estate. And then last, and it was said in the energy transition session, and it made me a little uncomfortable, and it made probably other economists, is maybe allow a little industrial policy. And the point here was, there could be national security benefits of domestic energy reliance and domestic mining, not depending on other countries who could be trading partners for critical resources, to be a net exporter of oil and gas, for example, and to domestically produce minerals. One of the reasons this makes me uncomfortable is it doesn't sound that different than arguments I've heard quite recently and probably are still being made, that it's a national security issue to abate climate change. And for that reason, we need a certain energy portfolio, we need certain kinds of energy assets. And so to me, it's a slippery slope when you can justify that there's some positive externality from a certain kind of industrial activity or a negative externality for another, like where does that end? I see the point about national security, and that was the 7th policy recommendation that came up. Terry, do you have anything to critique on that or add?
Oh, critique you mean, or, no, that was well done. I hope that you will feel free to interact with any and all of the speakers and us as we depart or go and enjoy the outdoors here. But I just want to first ask all of the audience and the two of us to say thanks to the speakers who were up here, the moderators and the panelists. They did what we wanted them to do and more. So to all of them, if you get on some of these calls where you've had an agent on the line and they say, please stay on to evaluate, and they give you the 1 to 5. 5 is high. If you bump into Condi, just tell her 5 and she'll know that you meant that for us. But really, thanks to all of you for sticking around all day, for listening. We're excited about having Hoover involved in markets versus mandates and these environmental issues. We hope that this keeps you thinking about what we're doing. You'll see things in the Hoover reports and so on. If you have ideas, you can I can give you Nick's email address. And no, seriously, if you have ideas of things that you think we should take on in markets versus mandates, let us know. We'd be more than happy to try to incorporate them as we move forward. And again, thanks for letting me escape Montana.